So on Wednesday, I had to attend the Shiva house in Hollywood, 6 p.m. Worst possible time to leave the Aventura area. I asked Waze for directions to get out of here, and honestly, it sent me through little streets in Hallanded that I have never driven before. I needed to be on time, and it was a challenge as I had no clue what I was driving. I need to admit that I have a problem with Waze. My problem is that I don't trust it. When my kids first introduced me to this program, we would suggest a route, and I look at the screen and I think to myself, that's not the way I usually go. And then they will tell, pero papi, that's the entire point. You have to trust that Waze is giving you the best directions, even if it's not how you would normally make this trip. So I began to realize that Waze and I had a trust problem, although I need to admit that somehow I always arrive. That resistance to trust made me think about something much deeper. How do we learn to trust? What happens when trust is broken? And maybe, most importantly, can it ever be rebuilt? The story of Abraham, our first patriarch, is at its core a story of trust. Lech lecha me'artzecha, go from your native land, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. No why, no how, not exactly where, just go. I read this story as the son of Jewish European immigrants who left everything behind to go to South America. And now I read it again as an immigrant myself who left a world behind to begin a new life in America. Do people really leave their homeland, their family, the culture, just because of a promise? What kind of faith does that take? What kind of trust? And in Abraham's and Sarah's case, it's getting even better. They waited years for the child they were promised, and when Isaac finally came, when the promise began to take shape, the God they needed to trust said, now take your son, your only son, who you love, and offer him as a sacrifice. Who can read that story without trembling? What was God thinking, asking for so much? What was Abraham thinking? What was Isaac thinking as he carried the wood up the mountain? Abraham's entire life seems to be a journey of trust. Trusting enough to live, trusting enough to hope, trusting enough to obey, and perhaps trusting too much. When you trust, usually you pay a high price. Because, for example, after the Akedah, the near sacrifice of Isaac, the Torah tells us, as you know, that Abraham returns alone. Isaac isn't with him. God never speaks to Abraham again. Something in the relationship, divine and human, is broken. I know you can argue that everyone passed the test, but everyone ended wounded. That's the thing about trust. When it's tested too far, it may survive, but it never comes back the same. And at the same time, trust is the foundation of everything we build: families, friendship, communities, nations. We trust doctors with our health, teachers with our children, pilots with our lives. We trust our partners with our hearts. And yet, each of us has moments when that trust is shaken. Maybe a friend betrayed your confidence. Maybe a promise wasn't kept. Maybe you believed in someone or something and ended disappointed. We all had that feeling when you realize the map you were following no longer makes sense. And still, we can't live without trust. You will agree with me that trust, or the lack of it, is one of the main central issues of our time. In America 2025, in Israel 2025. We are living in a time where institutions, leaders, and even neighbors are no longer assumed to be reliable. Trust, once the invisible glue of society, is fraying. Consider Israel. October 7 was a tragic reminder of what happens when vigilance falters, when intelligence fails, when trust is misplaced. Family walked to horror, lives were stolen, and a nation's sense of security was shattered. The shock was compounded by the failures we saw afterward. The government that should have been a shield faltered, structures meant to protect the people crumbled in public view. Trust in authority, trust in those sworn to safeguard was broken. We saw the last 2 years how in the midst of betrayal, the simple citizen, lacking trust in institutions, trusted each other. Citizens banded together to protect one another. Volunteers ran toward danger. Communities care for the grieving. This is a reminder that trust is not only something we receive, it's something we give, something we extend even when the evidence is uncertain, even when fear whispers that it's safer to doubt. In America, we feel it differently, but no less profoundly. Institutions are questioned, leaders are challenged, and the social contract itself feels tenuous. We argue not only about policy, but about whether facts, promises, and intentions can be trusted at all. And this erosion of trust creates a society that fears more than it hopes, that isolates more than it collaborates, that hesitates where courage is needed. Trust is the lifeblood of any society. Without it, alliances crumble, negotiations fail, governments lose legitimacy, and the simplest act of daily life, sending a child to a school, voting, receiving medical care, become acts of anxiety rather than acts of faith. Mistrust is contagious. When you stop trusting, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads, quietly like a virus on the soul. One act of betrayal, one disappointment, one broken promise, and suddenly your heart builds walls. Cynicism takes the place of hope, suspicion replaces openness, and soon you are no longer protecting yourself. You are imprisoning yourself. Mistrust is like a line of dominoes. Once the first one falls, everything that stood connected to it begins to collapse. Your faith in people, in love, in God, even in yourself, one by one, they go down. Until all that's left is isolation and the sound of your own doubts echoing where trust used to live. And here comes what I think is the Jewish spiritual position. Trust is not a luxury, it's a responsibility. It's a decision we make again and again, in private and in public, in tiny gestures and in monumental acts. To rebuild trust, we must confront failure honestly, demand accountability, but also refuse to let betrayal define our capacity to believe in one another. I know it's hard. We have learned how to question, but we are forgetting how to believe. A society without trust cannot breathe. A democracy without trust cannot stand. A family without trust cannot love. So I want to ask you this Shabbat morning, when was the last time you chose to trust? Not because you were sure, but because you simply hoped. Not because you could see the end, but because something deep inside you whispered, begin. Give it a chance anyway. Was it when you fell in love, knowing that love always carries the risk of loss? Was it when you forgave someone, not because they deserve it, but because you were tired of carrying the pain? Was it when you walked into a doctor's office or sent your child out into the world or stood at the graveside and chose to keep believing that life still held meaning? Was it when you said yes to a new chapter, a job, a move, a relationship, without knowing how it would unfold, only that you couldn't stay where you were? Think of that moment, that trembling, uncertain moment when you could have turned back, but didn't. When you said, I don't know what's ahead, but I'm going anyway. That's Lech Lecha. That's the journey. That's the map without directions. Maybe that's why God's first command to Abram wasn't believe, it was go. Like we heard before, you need to live. Because trust isn't something you feel, it's something you do. It's the decision to move forward even when the road is unfamiliar, even when your GPS or your Waze or your heart takes you to the back streets of a neighborhood and you are thinking, this can't be right. And yet somehow you arrive. You always arrive. Maybe that's the secret of faith. Not knowing the way, but moving anyway. Not seeing the destination, but trusting that it's there. Not being sure, but going forward step by step together. If you wait until you have all the answers, you will never begin the journey. If you demand guarantees, you will never know discovery. And if you refuse to risk trust, you'll never know love. So keep walking, keep trusting, keep believing that there is meaning in the road even when you can't see the destination. And maybe, just maybe, when we finally arrive, we look back and realize that all those unexpected turns, all those confusing detours were not mistakes. They were just the way home. Shabbat shalom.